thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. I think this is an incredibly important event and discussion, and I'm very pleased to be able to contribute to it in a small way, talking about the international process and framework, and in this particular case, looking specifically at what this looks like from a gender climate budget perspective. And I'll just give a little bit of background so that for those who aren't aware of how this has evolved under the international process, you have some small background on that. I would say that under the under the UNFCCC process, there's been a progression from the first mention of gender-related issues in a decision in 2001 that focused on the need to increase the representation of women in international climate decision-making process, to the decision in 2019 at COP25, where parties agreed a 5-year enhanced Lima work program on gender and gender action plan. And this evolution represents a growing understanding by parties of the relevance and importance of gender considerations, not only as a rights issue, which it clearly is, but in improving the effectiveness and fairness of climate policy and action. The COP25 decision recognised that the impacts of climate change are differentiated on women and men, and that this owes to historical and current gender inequalities and multi-dimensional factors, and is often more pronounced in developing countries and for local communities and in Indigenous peoples, and for Indigenous peoples. It also acknowledges the imperatives of a just transition of the workforce and the creation of decent work and quality jobs, and the need to take gender considerations into account when transitioning to low carbon, climate resilient economies and societies. And this is only amplified as a result of COVID-19, where we've seen a disproportionate impact, again, on women in particular because of their overrepresentation in the health sector and in care and responsibilities and roles within the paid and unpaid economy. The Lima work program, it's made up of a work program, so a framework, and as an annex, an action plan. And the work program includes open-ended long-term actions, such as an invitation to parties to nominate a national gender and climate change focal point, as well as some ongoing regular activities for the Secretariat. And the Gender Action Plan is organised by 5 priority areas under which different activities are grouped. The 5 priority areas are based on categories that were identified in over 55 decisions under the UNFCCC, including decisions related to the Paris Agreement. And these priority areas have been identified as critical in achieving effective gender responsive climate policy and action. And one of those areas, those priority areas, is gender responsive implementation and means of implementation. At the framework level, there is a reference as a recognition of the importance of gender responsive climate finance, which invites public and private entities to increase the gender responsiveness of climate finance with a view to strengthening the capacity, in particular, of women to contribute to policy, climate policy and action, and receive benefits from the responses. And there are also 2 specific activities, one which is very relevant to today's, to the meeting today and tomorrow, which seeks to increase the understanding of and support the capacity building on gender budgeting, including on the integration of gender responsive budgeting into national budgets to advance gender responsive climate policies, plans, strategies and actions. And that will involve submissions and from countries and from organisations who are supporting countries in implementing gender responsive budgeting, and expert group meetings. although it's planned for 2022, my expectation is that there will be events this year. And there's also a second piece looking at finance under the Gender Action Plan, because there is in fact financial and technical support available already to promote and strengthen gender integration in climate policies and action, and including, and so there's an action there to raise awareness of what already exists. And that is a focus for the Secretariat this year, although we won't necessarily be developing all of the activities or events on climate finance. We will be curating a series this year to bring together public, private, philanthropic, the full ecosystem of climate finance, to focus on some of the areas which have been identified as gaps and challenges, and that includes being able to properly track how climate finance is gender responsive, and that means having indicators that can track that information and being able to incorporate those, for instance, in national budgets or in climate financing mechanisms. A pilot being implemented by UNDP as part of the Global Support Program is supporting countries in integrating gender in their NDCs, in their nationally determined contributions. And 10 countries originally included in the pilot include Ghana, Kenya, Lebanon, Uganda, and Zambia. And they've been joined by 6 or 7 other countries, including Cote d'Ivoire, who are benefiting, had already decided to integrate gender and can benefit from that peer exchange. And within this early learning from this pilot, it is perhaps some things that are, when you look back on it, may seem like they're the building blocks also for how you integrate climate across different sectors. And that includes ensuring consultations are broad and deep in terms of who is involved within government, but also within civil society. Coordination mechanisms within government, and so vertical and horizontal, making sure that there are gender focal points, and aligning policy that already exists. So there's a lot of gender policy out there, making sure that there's a linkage between what's happening, for instance, on the Sustainable Development Goals and what you're doing on climate. And finally, monitoring and evaluation. And again, this comes back to the need for effective indicators. And I'm just going to finish with an example from an updated, or an NDC that was received last year from Cambodia. And it really illustrates these elements that are critical for being able to integrate gender in budgeting and finance. And so under the adaptation contribution, it was recognised and is stated in the NDC that they need to strengthen institutional capacities at national and subnational levels to integrate gender responsiveness in adaptation policies, plans and programming, and that includes gender sensitive budgeting. In relation to strengthening institutional capacities, that involves both adaptation and mitigation. And in enhancing monitoring and evaluation systems of sectoral ministries to track gender outcomes in climate initiatives, with a particular focus on collecting and managing sex desegregated data, gender indicators and budgeting, having outcomes-based reporting, and the dissemination and upscaling of gender and climate change adaptation related knowledge generation. Capacity building, capacity development is identified as being something that will be needed to allow sectoral ministries to implement gender analysis, gender responsive budgeting for the NDC. and that this is a tool for addressing existing gender inequalities by including this in climate policy and planning. And finally, that the SDG assessment of adaptation actions. So there is an assessment that all their adaptation actions contribute to SDG 5 on gender equality, and likewise adaptation on gender is seen to contribute to SDGs around climate, poverty and energy. So I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fleur. That was really helpful and informative. And I think it's, if anything, all the concerns that have arisen in the last year over the impact of COVID-19 have only underscored just how important it is to be able to come to a gender differentiated understanding of the impact of different macroeconomic shocks and the way that fiscal policy interventions of various kinds would be able to alleviate and overcome them. And so I'm interested to hear now from you, Ulrika, how do you view this, looking at the sort of the global landscape from the vantage point of a donor, but also just looking at it through the lens of the international architecture of support?
Thank you so much. And yes, I was asked to share some insights from a donor perspective on the importance of funding climate-related initiatives and how COVID-19 has affected or will affect funds allocated to climate change. So that's what I will focus on. But just to say some words from CEDA's perspective on to answer your question on how COVID-19 has affected or will affect funds allocated to climate change. The blunt answer is not so much. And I will just give a bit of background on why I say this. So, but guiding CEDA's work are broad and quite flexible bilateral, regional and global strategies for 5-year periods that are decided by our government. And with that as steering our work, this has given us a lot of flexibility in discussion with partners and on allocation of funds. And we can't say that, or we don't see that less funds are going to climate change given the pandemic and some reallocations within programs. But it is important to remember that COVID-19 has very broad implications in when it comes to, I mean, everything from economic development to health to education to energy, etc. And we all know that the root causes are very much linked to how we treat our planet, our ecosystems, and so forth. And we therefore at CEDA see it as we need to take a broad approach when it comes to tackle the consequences of COVID-19. And in a short-term perspective, we, in our support to environment and climate change, reallocated some funds, for example, to renewable energy programs, to health centers, etc. But given the government now in Sweden is very committed when it comes to climate change and environmental questions in general, and we don't see it go away at all, including a discussion on less funding to climate change. But having said that, from a global perspective, one could be worried. Will there be a green equal recovery with financial flows to match those needs that will come up and take into consideration human rights and non-fossil developments? But I think that out there, talking about the global level, there are some promising signs with, for example, OECD DAC and their latest high-level meeting in November with explicit commitments on a green recovery. The EU in the Green Deal, also stating the same, and also with the new US administration. So that's more on a general level. But to come back to the African context, I think we all know that debt in African economies has skyrocketed post or during COVID. And the World Bank, IMF, OECD, and the UN are working on a platform to tackle debt, climate, and nature post COVID. And I think African countries can apply to this platform to link debt relief and debt management to climate and nature outcomes, which could be one thing to look at. And another thing I wanted to bring up is that as countries seek to stimulate their economies to boost economic growth and incomes, they must aim for an inclusive and green recovery post-COVID-19. And this can include investments in renewable energy, in labor-intensive afforestation, and support to small-scale fisheries. And also another thing I wanted to bring up is that the priority post-COVID is, of course, jobs and livelihoods, especially for youth. And climate and environment can generate many formal and informal employment opportunities, such as public employment nature programs, as the Working for Water programs in South Africa, the rural energy, informal energy markets in East Africa, and also others. But then to come back, just to end with where we at CEDA are when it comes to climate finance, I just wanted to mention that about 18% of CEDA's total budget and went to climate change finance during 2019, and the top 5 countries receiving most funding are all in Africa. And also maybe it could be of interest to know that we fund mainly adaptation programs, lesser amount of when it goes to mitigation, but also quite a lot, 33% went to cross-cutting programs that have both adaptation and mitigations goals with the work. And also we do also try to work and more and more with mobilizing capital. By the end of 2019, CEDA's guaranteed volume in its total portfolio amounted to nearly 7 billion Swedish kronor, and that in its turn had generated almost 17 billion Swedish kronor in mobilized capital, and made about 34 billion Swedish kronor available for lending. So that's also something that is important to look at, and we do it all the time, try to work more and more with mobilizing capital through public-private development partnerships and challenge funds. But just to end, I think Sweden, just want to say that Sweden remained committed in terms of funding climate-related initiatives for a sustainable future, and also now during COVID-19, but also in a longer-term perspective. So thank you very much. I'll end there, and I'm happy to have a discussion after all the panelists have spoken. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ulrika. I would now like to turn it over without further ado to Nana, who is going to talk about the experience of Ghana and is going to help us understand how do you reconcile all of this if you are sitting in a Ministry of Finance that has to make prioritization decisions and spending decisions, facing a very finite budget envelope.
I would start off with a study that we actually did in 2015, sponsored by the UNDP and then the ODI in the Ministry of Finance, into looking at how we integrate climate budgeting into our mainstream. Actually, after the study, there were some challenges that we needed to address. A lot of this actually bordered on how climate change relevant expenditure actually is not yet recognized through any specific tagging or any other process through the national budget. This, we had to engage several stakeholders, actually, the development partners, the 9 ministries, the Ministry of Finance itself, because in Ghana, our policy spans for 4 years, and after 4 years, there's a review or there's a new policy in place. Now we are looking at how this policy can also be tracked from year after year through the national budget. What gets measured gets done. We want to know where we are. But then the financial systems, the acts, and then regulations that we have as the Ministry of Finance actually makes it very difficult. I had a chat with some experts to say, okay, for some policies, you can be able to reallocate funding. Here in our PFM Act and regulations, when you want to reallocate funding, you are pressed with a challenge where there are other parameters that you even have to consider, because if you allocate funding for one policy, which will cut across another program, that means that you cannot actually do that. So there are some of these challenges in here as well. But on the side of Ghana, this is what we actually did. We actually went back to the drawing table. We looked at our chart of account, which actually allows us to track all budget expenditures in the same course that we also prepare in the budget. Actually, it's a listing of all the accounts in our general ledger. We needed to make sure that we're able to track climate change-related expenditure from the time we start our planning, okay, to the time we prepare our reports. So we looked at all the actors involved or the stakeholders involved. We identified some of the policies that we have developed as a country. This we actually put in a manual. We looked at some keywords that we actually use in identifying some of these climate change-related expenditures. We looked at our policies and how we actually put them in our budget. Then what we did is that we tried to tag some of this within our budget as well. So through our chart of accounts, currently, we are able to track some of these climate change-related expenditures from entity, from the national level to the district level, and then we are able to report on same as well. However, there is some challenge that we still have here. We still have funding coming from some other sources which don't come through the budget. As such, our report is missing some of them. Some of them are misreported. Some of them we don't even get to know till the partner or the implementer has a challenge in the disbursement or the implementation of the program. That is where we then get to know some of the programs that are being undertaken by some of our partners with this. Altogether, we have also been able to have some trainings on climate budgeting, because as part of the challenges that we noticed that though some persons try to make efforts to prepare their budgets to mitigate or adapt to some of these policies, but we noticed that the process that they have to go through to do this was different from what was actually perceived. So we had to build capacity in this regard for our line ministries to be able to now prepare their budget and also track this within the national budget as well. Currently, we have some MDAs using some in-house developed dashboards, which we call Climate Track, gives you the allocations to some of these climate policies from 2018 to date. Some of the tool is able to also give you the actual expenditures to some of these allocations that is made from 2018 to date. But there's still some capacity gaps that we are trying to address, some technological gaps, as in how we also try to get some of the reallocated funds reported to the original funding sources, because the PFM Act also sees reallocation in a different light, and that has been one of our main challenges when it comes to climate change budget tagging and then tracking in the context of Ghana as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nana. That was super interesting. Then I have here a question to Fleur about what is it that you've been learning from the sort of the tools and instruments for climate change that would also apply to gender. I mean, you can probably see that question there. For yourself, then there's another question also for Fleur about how UNFCCC would be able to help countries tap into the full ecosystem of climate finance. I think that's clearly a super interesting question, that sort of discrepancy of information that sometimes is just very hard to know even where you would have to look and deal with the transaction costs of being able to access different types of support and different sources of funding. Then there's a question here for everybody about the I guess the use and usefulness of debt swaps, debt for X swaps, and to what extent that might incentivize additional spending in those areas. And then finally, a question from our very own Binyam, who's saying, this is for Eureka, what do you think are the main lessons the climate change community should draw from successes and failure on the global response to COVID in terms of coordination, financing, and technological innovation? Just, you know, I think we probably all saw in the course of this year, there were these caricatures that were making the rounds on social media where you're sort of saying a poor person standing outside with this wave of COVID risk coming your way, and you're sort of trying to figure out how to deal with that. And then there's the much bigger wave of climate related risk that is towering over anything that is resulting from the short-term impact of COVID. And so I think that confluence of, okay, we're already emerging from a massive shock whilst we're having to make all these decisions is on a lot of people's minds. And then finally, Prudence is asking, I think this is a question of, do you have any examples for how the information that is being collected and the tools that are being used has already had an impact on allocative decisions? Fleur, over to you.
Thank you. And thanks for the questions. I think the first question around evidence is a really important one, and it's actually something that has been recognised as part of the Gender Action Plan as being needed. It's not that there isn't evidence, but a lot of the evidence is quite specific either to projects or programs around, and so having broader evidence of the effectiveness or the impact on effectiveness across economy-wide options. So looking at transport sector or looking at the energy sector, or looking at this in a much broader sense is part of what needs to be done. And it's something that we fully expect to come out of the pilot project that I would refer to that UNDP is doing on the NDCs, because it's looking at it at an NDC economy-wide view. So there is evidence, and certainly being able to put what is referred to as the business case forward on this is an important element of being able to ensure that everybody understands why you would want to make sure that you understand who's using public transport, for instance, and any policy or funding or spending, understanding who is going to benefit from that and how that might influence the impact on climate. In terms of we are curating a series of events this year, which will be public mostly, although there will be a couple of events that are designed for institutions to come together to do some technical work on the challenges that they've identified already. And there is still a lot of capacity building to be done outside of the multilateral development banks on what gender responsive finance looks like. So part of this is to not only raise awareness of what is already available, but it's also to create some radical collaboration amongst financial institutions to help sort of move this forward this year.
Thank you, Fleur. That was really helpful. Ulrika, do you want to go next?
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you for very, very interesting questions. I think I'll, looking at time, I'll just focus on the one mainly on one directed to me, on what do you think are the main lessons that climate change community should draw from the successes and failures of the global response to COVID-19 in terms of coordination, financing, and technological innovation. And that's, of course, a very challenging question, but an important one. And I would just say there that unfortunately, I know that the Stockholm Environment Institute tried to look at well, what are the lessons learned up to now in terms of a green recovery or not when it comes to fossil investments. And unfortunately, what we have all been pushing hard for, of course, from our side, from the Swedish side, the whole building back better and greener and fairer, I think has proven so far that it doesn't look as good as it could look when it comes to the green recovery. So I think what we need to do is, of course, constantly follow up on the investments made and push the donor community and the larger community in moving ahead in the right direction. From CEDA's perspective, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, we have had very flexible bilateral, regional, global strategies that has given us the opportunity to think think broadly and strategically in our work ahead. And one thing that I picked up that I think is very interesting and is that when you also try to strengthen, for example, health systems, that you also in that also build health systems that will be relevant and have the right kind of setup for the climate change related diseases that we will see more of coming in the years ahead. So that you, in everything you do in whatever sector you work with, that you have that broader perspective in your recovery work. And also another thing that I think we're talking about all the time when it comes to climate change finance is the locally led, and the importance of locally led processes when it comes to especially adaptation. But I think that this goes also for the whole of the recovery work. And also just lastly, maybe saying that I think we should use the coordination platforms that we have for our work as donors, and we are also putting lots of efforts into, for example, coordinating ourselves or learning from each other in the OECD DAC context, but also under the EU and under also bilaterally in countries among donors. I think we can do much more there to move ahead in the right direction when it comes to coordination and financing and innovation as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ulrika. Nana, do you have any response or final thoughts to the questions that were raised, even the things that your co-panelists just raised?
I just wanted to touch on the question Prudence asked. Actually, So you start to measure, you don't really know what's getting done. So we started to track this from a budget perspective. Then we noticed that some policies and programs as being designed nationally were not being allocated resources at the various subnational levels or districts. And we noticed that in scenarios where there was allocation, it was about just about 2% of the total budget for a particular district. Then we noticed that the prioritization to some of these policies was very low in the area of climate change as well. So we had to now start to get them to understand what some of the policies actually mean, what we are trying to achieve with some of those policies. And by so doing, we have actually been able to, we've actually seen an increase in some of the allocations to some of these policies that we have within our policy framework as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nana. Maybe just one note of conclusion is that, like, if there's one thing that I'm taking away from this session, is just how much of an analytical burden it puts on ministries of finance to take the challenge of climate change seriously and try and turn that into budget decisions, where, of course, in every sector, it's difficult to know what the spending, the marginal additional spending is going to do. We very often don't know what an extra dollar spent on education is actually going to do for learning. But we can be pretty sure that if we're procuring textbooks, that's probably an education expense. Whereas when it comes to climate change, there's a lot of analytical work and there's a lot of policy thinking that needs to go into even trying to figure out what makes a climate change related expenditure in the first place. And so I think I'm very excited for the following sessions. We're going to have some interesting country examples on budget preparation and budget approval coming up after the break. And I'm very grateful for the time that our panelists gave to us to make this a super interesting opening session. And thank you, everyone.